How are you doing?
Long time no see. Good to see you, man.
It's been a little bit, yes. Um, oh man, this audio thing is going to drive me nuts. Well, welcome. I'm glad that you're
Thank you
here.
for having me.
Yeah. So, do you want to tell everyone? Well, I suppose how we know each other and where you are in the world, because you're the second remote guest that I've had.
Wow. Well, yes. So, my wonderful wife happens to be your mother's sister, which I believe, if I'm correct, that makes you my nephew.
That's correct.
I think that is correct. Thank you. I'm glad I didn't get that one wrong. Yes, and we're talking. I'm now in the great state of Texas, in the city of Houston. A little bit about myself. Well, originally from Calgary, Canada. Entered the oil industry there, and then we moved to Wichita, Kansas, many years ago. Spent a few years there in oil and gas, corporate finance, accounting type stuff. Then moved to Houston. Spent been here like close to 20 years, I think now, living in Houston. But that's the professional side. Probably more interesting now, the things that are going on is sort of on my hobby side. So my original degree was in exegetical theology, but I always had more of a philosophical interest, and have always kept it up to some degree. But then recently completed a master's in philosophy from Leeds, and that's kind of like opened up some interesting opportunities to speak. I've lectured a few times at Texas A&M on ethics. So any time that's not taken up at work is kind of delving into ethics, right and wrong, truth, beauty, goodness, all that type of stuff.
Cool. It's a good mix. Okay, so I haven't yet figured out why this is doing it, but every time I'm cutting, it keeps on muting, and I can't even hear anything as soon as I stop. As soon as like I cut over to me, so like right now I can hear you, but as soon as I go back to me, so I'm probably just going to keep the camera on you for a lot of this. Just a little heads up. But okay, so you've had an interest in philosophy for a long time now, and you've got a pretty good background with like accounting and a lot of things that are, well, I could say they're more precise and a little bit more not synthetic. Yeah, that there's not so much room for there's not the same kind of like openness that philosophy gives. Like philosophy, you're gonna have to like assume, and correctly, that I know next to nothing about philosophy. So when you say that you're in it, I'm curious, like, how do you have these two completely opposite, like left brain, right brain draws with like accounting and that kind of area, and then in philosophy, like where did these two things come from?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. So, I think originally my interest in accounting was extremely pragmatic. And that means, I did not pursue accountancy because it was the passion of my life, so to speak. I needed a job. It seemed stable. That it was nothing more complicated than that. But then once you get into the field, it's kind of like, the idea of accounting is actually quite broad. You can go into a lot of different things. So if you think about, kind of the stuff that you're alluding to, right? Preciseness, accuracy, how many dollars, how many cents do you have in the bank? Yeah, I did that, but that's not really even where my career in accounting went, because there's also parts in accounting that are quite abstract. When you talk about different things in accounting, a lease. Okay, here's an example. So you go and you buy a car, and then you say, well, that's your car, right? You own the car. But you could also lease the car for a long period of time. And let's say the car lasts 10 years. You could lease the car for 10 years. So from an accounting perspective, at what point have you really bought the car? Because you're committed to it until it dies. How is that different than buying the car? It's kind of abstract, right?
Yeah, I kind of see what you mean by that. That's a good analogy there.
Yeah, and that's kind of stuff that I dealt with for a lot of my accounting career. Is an area called technical accounting, where you would deal with some like the more abstract parts of it. Um, so, I think that did fit with my personality. But no, I find much more of a passion, with respect to, the philosophy, the theology, than the accounting. The accounting was kind of like, means to an end, so to speak.
Yeah, it's sort of like just the way that the thought process would manifest, but the thought process translates across both areas.
Yeah, it does, and like I said, in certain areas, definitely.
Okay, so now that you said that you've done a few lectures over at Leeds, can you maybe talk a bit about how those came about? Like, who brought you on to do that? Like, because you went to Leeds, you have your degree from there, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so I did that via distance actually. So I did not actually go there in person. I had planned to go there for graduation, and then unfortunately, the COVID happened, and that did not occur. As far as the lectures, so I actually did a podcast for Leeds based on my dissertation. My dissertation was on corporate responsibility, which we can talk about, but they really liked it. And they actually have a podcast on applied topics and ethics. And so they asked me to come on and basically talk about my dissertation. So that was very interesting. I enjoyed that. As far as the lectures, that is actually at Texas A&M. And through some colleagues, I happen to know a professor at A&M, and she asked me to go and give some guest lectures. So I've lectured 3 times there now on topics and ethics. So same type of area, and just loved it. Particularly the last one was interesting because the last one was a Zoom lecture, and it's not the same.
No, you got to have them in the room.
No, because part of it is the energy. I mean, this was undergraduate class, 200-300 students in a lecture theater. You go there, and as soon as you're on stage, like you get the adrenaline kick, if you know what I mean. So
Yeah,
you get that, and then you can kind of read the students, and when you ask questions, you can see the ones that put their hand up, and you can point them and have the conversation. That just doesn't work in a Zoom environment. But the Zoom went well. Got some good feedback on it, but it's just it's not the same. I would look forward to the day when we can have sort of 3-dimensional conversations again. I think that would be great.
Yeah, the technology is definitely getting better and better, and it's feeling more and more. Maybe I'm just getting used to it, but it's feeling more and more like the tools are beginning to reflect human isms and habits and ways that we communicate, and like adding things like chat in the middle of a call, because you kind of have like little side conversations with people, but it's still kind of behind on the lecture side. We haven't really figured out how to make virtual addressing to a large crowd feel like addressing a large crowd. Like you only know by looking at the view stats. That's kind of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I'm working on some other lectures that I hope to find an audience for. So, yeah, I mean, literally it's taking up any time I'm not sort of relaxing or exercising or working. It's kind of like what I do now.
For the lectures and the ethics side, I'm actually specifically curious about that because I know next to nothing about it. I'm curious. Ethics, it definitely feels at home to bring that in early on to any kind of philosophical debate, discussion, or topic of any kind, because it's kind of that playground. Philosophy is a playground where you can explore areas and modes of thinking that very quickly would leave some people like wide-eyed thinking, how could you entertain that idea? Because there's some that are pretty bad if you follow them to their natural consequences. Some of them sound like a good idea at first, but the results are detrimental to groups of people, to all kinds of different things. So tell me a little bit about what your topics that you covered in the ethical side of this lecture was.
So, okay, so let me step back a little bit, because you have a lot of great comments there, but I want to unpack them a little bit. So, when people talk about ethics, they often think maybe a little bit often about like right and wrong, breaking a rule, punishment, maybe things like that. But historically, that really wasn't what ethics was about. If you go back to the original idea, the original idea was, how should you live your life? What is a good life? You know, how should you spend the time of your life? Because a good life is an ethical life. So in some ways it gets abstract, but in other ways it's so viscerally real. Because I mean, what more important question could you ask than how should I live my life? Of course, then it goes into other topics too, because, you know, maybe, you know, truth matters in how you live your life, right? I mean, that could impact how you want to live your life, truth. And then you almost, you know, then we're social animals. We get along with each other. And so that introduces politics. What kind of political system do we want to have to support us in living an ethical life? So I think this is why I find this area so important, because, like, once again, is there a more important question for us individually than how should we live our lives? The lectures I've been giving talk about that, but because of my background, I really talk a lot about business ethics, although a lot of the things I talk about in business ethics really transcend environments. So for example, my dissertation, it really talked about the question of, you know, when should you be held responsible for something that happens versus when you're in a group. So in a corporation does things and things go bad. So when should the corporation be blamed versus you being blamed? But you can draw it more broadly. You could talk about society. If your country goes to war and does a bunch of bad things and you voted for that government, should you be responsible? What if you're military and your group does something bad? Should you be responsible? So I discussed it within context of business, but these questions are wider and broader. What do you think about that?
Also, my microphone died, apparently. This is going really well. I like that you... sorry, I'm just going to live on your camera for a little bit here. I like how you brought ethics in from the perspective of this is the... Like, I just kind of interpreted your answer as, like, this is the voice of reason in the room. So you have a bunch of people squabbling over different forms of how to think, how to do this, how to do that. And then ethics is this topic of... it's the voice of reality. It's like that practical aspect of, okay, how does this actually interact with day-to-day life? And that does have implications based on a group, based on an individual. So is there like a division of ethics between like the person versus the group or versus the country? Like, how does that all play together?
So, I mean, that is really the question. And sometimes it's not clear. I mean, I can break it down maybe three different ways. So there are certain situations where a person does something and it has bad consequences. And you say, well, who's responsible for doing it? Well, it's quite clear that he was. And then you might say, well, if this person's responsible, like, were they coerced into doing it, right? You know, Nathan, if I told you to do something and hold a gun to your head and say, if you don't do it, I'm going to pull the trigger. Well, that wasn't like your free will. You were coerced. But if you take all that out of the way, then it's quite clear that you did it. But then there's other situations where, when you try to look at what was going on, there were a lot of social influences that were involved. So there's one interesting example that I've given in a lecture. It was called ash lines. So this was an experiment that was done, and the psychologist had one line on the left and like 3 lines on the right. And the question was, which line on the right is the same height as the line on the left? And this was like very clear. I mean, there's no illusion here. It's very, very clear. And it was the type of thing that he went and asked a bunch of people, and 99% of the people got it right. You're always going to have one person who thinks it's a joke or something, but 99% of the people got it right. Then he did something different. He asked people in groups. So I forget how many, but there's a number of people, and he'd ask a whole bunch of people, and then he'd go to you, and he'd ask you that same question. The interesting thing is everyone before you was an actor, and they gave the wrong answer. If you were the last one in the row and everyone before you gave the wrong answer, you tended to give the wrong answer 75% of the time.
That is interesting with the peer pressure aspect of it.
Exactly. So you have to ask yourself, if you're in a situation with that kind of peer pressure, and we know this happens, I mean, we've done the research, to what degree do I blame you? And to what degree do I blame the group? But here's the thing that gets played out. If I go and say, okay, Nathan, I'm going to blame you because you gave the wrong answer. You're to blame. You could come back at me and say, well, no, I mean, if those people had not been in the room, I would have given you the right answer. Therefore, it's not my fault. So then you go to the other people and you say, okay, you're to blame for Nathan giving the wrong answer. And they're going to say, no, we did not coerce Nathan. We did not coach him. He gave that choice of his own free will. So who do you blame? Do we need to blame?
This whole scenario is, it's void of taking into consideration how humans behave. Because this is a great experiment. I love this idea. And then as soon as you take it and put it in a real world situation, you do have people blaming. You do have people pointing the finger to the point where it's almost strange if no one gets blamed, because it's just, you got to blame somebody all the time. It's always who's at fault. Like insurance companies always want to know who's at fault. We're just so habitually conditioned to expect that someone is to blame, and as soon as you blame other people, then you tell them, oh, no, you're just going to try to pass the buck. But this is instilled in us by all of our examples. So just in the same way how you say all the people before the last person in the room were actors, I kind of lost my train of thought there. But in that condition, like they're being led to give the wrong answer based on peer pressure. So if we live in a world where we're surrounded by people who are perhaps doing the wrong thing, the more immoral thing, or the self-interested thing that doesn't help the group but it helps them individually, then that becomes a habit that we learn just by association, by being around it. And so that becomes instilled as repeated behavior. But also I suppose it's difficult to prove who the actors are, because that person didn't know that they were actors.
No, it did not. But, the traditional great questions of philosophy is like, what is truth, goodness, and beauty, right? All these great questions. But sometimes I think the two greatest questions, contemporary questions, are A, why do good people do bad things? Because we see people do bad things. But if you ever meet these people, they're not bad people. They love their dogs, they love their kids, whatever. They're not bad people. But then also the other question is, why do very intelligent people believe stupid things? There are some things that are just blatantly, obviously not true, but you have intelligent people believing them. So I think, some of these ethical questions kind of go into that, right? Because we say we blame these people for doing bad things, but they're not necessarily bad people necessarily.
Right. I suppose what I would then want to know, like if we push this a little bit further, is if these very intelligent people are making bad decisions let's say based on peer pressure, and then you want to turn around and point the finger and say, well, you know better. Like you do know better. You are perfectly capable of thinking through this situation and making the correct decision instead of resorting to the lizard brain and going with the group. But at what point does the stress test of life pressures, complications, the sheer volume of problems that we have to deal with on a regular basis, at what point is that justified in overriding the logical side of our brain to where we make stupid decisions, even though we do know better?
Yeah, so two things about that. So and this is one thing I actually brought out in my dissertation. Just because let's say you do something wrong, but I choose not to blame you. That doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences for you, because it's quite possible that what you do tells me something about your character. So let's say you had a person who couldn't stop kicking other people. They just went around and involuntarily kicked other people. Okay, well, you wouldn't blame them for it. I mean, they had no choice. It's a defect. They can't help it. But just because you don't blame them for it doesn't mean there shouldn't be consequences. Like maybe you don't invite that person over for dinner because you don't want to get kicked. Maybe we have to put that person in jail to protect others from getting kicked. So I think, even a situation like this where, the person is not thinking correctly because of all the things that are going on, doesn't mean we can't step back and say, hey, how do we make it better? How do we make it so that things like this don't happen again? Pressure, another interesting study. So it was talking about time pressure. So time pressure and whether you do the right thing or not. So they went it was Princeton Theological Seminary. Went to Princeton Theological Seminary and told all the people in the class to draft a sermon on the Good Samaritan, which, for anyone who might be watching it, a story, Jesus was asked, who is my neighbor? And there was someone in need. The person who stopped him, helped them, was a Samaritan who didn't necessarily like the person, but because he took care of them, he was the Good Samaritan. So the idea is that we should be good Samaritans and help those in need, essentially, because they are our brother. So back to Princeton. So they said, you have to go and do a sermon on the Good Samaritan and then deliver it for grade across the campus. But they had 3 different cohorts when they did this. One is they said, hey, no rush, just go across the campus and deliver the sermon. That was cohort number 1. Cohort number 2 said, hey, yeah, you're not late, but you need to get over there, so hustle over right now because they're expecting you. The last cohort was, you're late. No, you need to run because they're already waiting for you. You're past time. The interesting thing is when they did this, in order to get to the place where the sermon had to be delivered, they had an actor, of course. And they literally had to step over this person, and the person was clearly acting like they were in need. Well, the first cohort of people who were not in a rush, about 2/3 of the people stopped to help. So think about this. Princeton Theological Seminary, you just did a sermon on the Good Samaritan, and there's a real-life situation, 2/3 stop. The next cohort, I think it went down to 20%. The last ones who were in a rush went down to 10%.
I would love to hear what was going through the heads when they stepped over that person, because I bet they registered and had a connection somewhere.
Maybe, but sometimes when you get in that situation, is a thing called ethical blindness, where there are certain things that essentially distract you so much. I mean, they weren't thinking about the Good Samaritan. They weren't thinking about the person they just stepped over. They were thinking, I'm late to get over to deliver my sermon. And so by putting that pressure, kind of it distorts what you see as a moral situation. Interesting, huh?
It's really interesting.
What do we want to do? What do we want to do? Well, so what you want to do is kind of create environments to help people make the right decision. But then they also have to know what the right thing is to do. So it can be complex. As I say, in the sermon, in the lectures I give at A&M, one of the things I end the lecture with is a 3-legged stool. And the 3-legged stool is sort of a metaphor for what I think we need in ethics. And one leg of the stool is personal agency. And that's something that's really getting lost today, which we can talk about that. But personal agency is a big problem today. The second leg of the stool is our social surroundings. So in other words, I can think I'm a really good person, but it's kind of like the ash lines. If like 5 people ahead of me give the wrong answer, I tend to go along with it. But then the third leg of the stool is the culture. By that I mean broader culture. Do you have appropriate institutions? Because you might try to create a good company or a good community, but if the broader institutions don't support you, if you don't have the rule of law, if you don't have law enforcement, if you don't have all of these great liberal institutions that have worked for so well for so long, imperfectly, then it's going to be really hard to do the right thing. So those three legs of the stool, you kind of all need them to work. And once again, it's not perfect, but it's definitely a good path forward.
Yeah, I like how you call it a stool leg as well, because that's a nice visual to kind of kibosh any such ignorant question as to, well, which is the most important, because that's ridiculous.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting because like after I lecture, they always all the students give you cards, and they required to do it, and most of them are just obligatory. But every so often, there's a few that are meaningful. And I've gotten a few people who have said, I will remember the stool, which is kind of cool.
I love the stool analogy. Like, actually, that was first introduced to me by my dad back when I don't remember how old, quite young. But he first told us about how a four-legged chair is actually never stable. There's always like an imbalance of where things are leaning. So the three-legged stool has always like kind of been burnt in my memory. It's like, oh, that's a cool way to look at things. Like something about threes.
Yeah. You're right. You're right.
Real quick about the whole, like going back to the consequences thing, like the theoretical figure who can't stop kicking people. Yes, there are consequences. There's natural consequences. I don't know if there's like a term to differentiate between natural consequences and conscious choices made by other people in response to an action, which I suppose is one way of saying a consequence, but someone else chose to make the action or the choice that they did, such as arresting someone and putting them in jail for repeatedly kicking people, again, still living with the same idea. So I suppose this might be I don't know if this is your area of expertise or not, but where do lawmakers take in these two forms of reaction into the consideration when they're picking or making like consequences or laws or penalties for certain actions? Like which ones are just natural consequences and we just let that be, and which ones do they need to add or synthesize some kind of a reaction?
Boy, those are good questions. So historically, the legal system was based on a certain view, and that view is that when something goes bad, you have to find someone to blame. It's like what you were talking about, a few minutes ago, and it's almost like you have to find someone to blame. The explanation that I give, that you could have a situation where something goes wrong and you don't blame someone, that's almost not acceptable because it's embedded within the legal framework. And then once you find someone, you have to go and punish them. It's still our legal system still has a certain sort of tribal retribution character to it. And that's not good, because it ignores the fact that when you have some of these situations, there are cultural things that are not reflected in the free will of the person who did it. So it's almost like you need to understand what the situation was, but we still need to respond. So like when you talk about natural consequences, right? That is something like, a storm comes and blows away your house. And we say there's no one to blame, so we call it an act of God. Well, we don't blame God generally, but we, or sometimes we do, but we call it.
Sometimes we sure do.
Sometimes we do, but we call it an act of God, right? But that's a little bit different, say, than when something happens and we have to morally decide how we're going to respond to it individually or as a country. So then we have to say, what is the moral reaction to this? Do we put the person away? Punishment probably doesn't do a lot. How can we help them? What is the real cause of it? Because I think, sometimes that is the biggest thing. We don't spend enough time to actually understand the causes of unethical behavior, and therefore our responses are inadequate.
In the situation where there's not really anyone to blame, or let's say the situation is something where somebody does something intentional and results in something painful or bad for someone else, but let's go back and add in another situation where like 5 people ahead of them did something bad, and now they are feeling the pressure, even though there was no coercion to make them do something bad. They did it. And have you ever seen that influence, say, the observers, the people around the town, the village, the city, whoever it is, who observe this thing or hear about it, read about it, watch it in the news, if they are crying for a penalty and then they're enlightened as to more of the situation, does that cry for justice ever die down, or does that get pushed aside as, no, this is no excuse, we still need to see some form of punishment?
So the moral answer is that a compassionate answer is that desire for retribution should be squelched. And you see examples of this. There was an incident in Dallas, and a person was killed and by a policeman, and it was an accident. And I think the policeman ended up being charged at some level. And then it was a relative of the person who was killed and went over and like hugged the policeman, because the situation was just one of pain, right? There was no good here. And so that is a tremendous moral response. But on the other side, there are situations where, no, I suffered loss and I want you to suffer greater loss, right? That's sort of tribal justice. And here's part of the problem with this tribal justice. So what we find from the field of moral psychology is that we do a pretty good job of taking care of ourselves. And what I mean by that is, we get things wrong, but, other than people with issues that like do self-harm, we tend to take care of ourselves pretty good. And then we tend to take care of those that we love, right? Family, genetic family, genes have a lot to do with it, but also just spouses and people that we love. Then we take care somewhat of people like us, but it really starts to go downhill once you get too far from sort of like our center. So why this is important is that when you get people who are different than you, what we need to do is try and bring everyone together. And if we're going to bring everyone together, then you really have to start to emphasize our common humanity. You need to start taking down, victim and oppressor, this person doing that. Because the more you bring up these walls, the more we're not going to be able to get past our internal locus of psychological benefit. That was a bit rambling, but you kind of get what I was trying to get at?
Yeah, I see what you mean. And I do see how it can quickly fall off how many people you can care about deeply. I think it's called a Dunbar number, the 100 or 150 people, which is like the maximum number that you're able to hold on to, that you like at a time in your life where you actually like know them and interact with them. Yeah, you're right though. It's got to have some kind of a guidance for outside of that, so that we don't do harm outside of our own little communities.
No, and this is why, what's happening now in society. So there was, some of my research, one of the things I looked at was the concept of the individual. Because if you're going to have individual morality, you have to understand, like, why is an individual important? And there's one fellow who trace back to the importance of the individual to Christianity. If you think about prior times, I mean, yes, you had individuals, but I'm talking about the individual as being like something sacred, something uniquely important. Well, no, you had tribes and families. You didn't really have the individual as being important. But with Christianity, all of a sudden, you had one God. You've got to remember, in the Old Testament, you know, the God of the Jews was not considered the only God. He was considered the biggest and baddest God. Like, he was the one that was going to smite you. But it was a polytheistic time. But with Christianity and some influence from Greek philosophy, that changed. So now, no, that God wasn't the biggest God amongst many. That was the only God. And once you have one God, then there's neither Jew nor Gentile. Now, every individual is unique under God. Now, that's not like it was ever perfect, but it was like a North Star point. And that North Star point of the individual being important, then all of a sudden gets into, through philosophy, into like the Declaration of Independence in the U.S. You know, we believe these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, et cetera, et cetera. Goes into Martin Luther King. I have a dream that one day my children will live to see a day where they're not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. You see, individuals matter. But what we see today is now sort of this, a very illiberal moment where everything is about identity. It's kind of like we're flipping Martin Luther King on his head and saying, well, no, I have a dream where a person is not judged by the content of their character, but by the color of their skin. Everything is categories. And this is very bad, because if you start dissecting us into categories, how do you bring us together?
It's one of those theoretical ideas where, like, at surface level, it sounds empowering to people who maybe don't have a sense of self-worth or feel like they are second-class citizens, where it's like, no, you are intrinsically valuable regardless of what you do. But if you follow that train of thought to the end, you do end up with more division than ever. But that's not a topic that a lot of people really want to end up at. They end up kind of stopping it early on in the conversation or justifying it.
Yes, I think that's true.
That's true. How have you found any helpful kind of, I could call it a debate, or I could call it, I don't know, some conversation topic that meets people who believe that flipped Martin Luther King's ideology flipped on its head, as just described? They believe in that. They think that this is a good idea. Have you found any kind of useful conversation or argument or way of addressing that?
Boy, that's $1 million question. Because it's been somewhat discussed. I would say at this point, I have not, because it depends upon like how much the person is within a certain zeitgeist of philosophy and worldview. Because, okay, so let's unpack this in a slightly different way. So, you know, in philosophy, historically, truth has been very important, right? I mean, you know, what is truth? And it's called epistemology and all this good stuff. But I think often for most people, the most important thing is not really truth, it's meaning. People maybe like some truth in their lives, but they need meaning. And so historically, if you were to say, like, you know, what are the things that give people meaning in their life? Well, you had family, and family was goods or bad, but pretty stable, traditional. That was a point of meaning. You had country, right, and some patriotism, right? Maybe more in the U.S., but Canada had their own version of patriotism, even if it was just not being American. But you had some patriotism in Canada, you bet. And then you had faith. And maybe you didn't go to church every Sunday, but you still identified with a church group. You probably still went to church, to synagogue, or mass every so often. And so these sort of three things go back to our three-legged stool, kind of gave meaning to a lot of people. Okay, so that kind of makes sense, I think. So where are we today? Traditional family. How many divorced people do you know? I know several. That's not uncommon. Because we entered globalization, people don't have that sense of community. You might not even know the people that you grew up with, or that situation. The patriotism is not like it used to be. I mean, you have certain ideas, at least in America, that blame every problem on the globe to the United States of America. Totally irrational. I mean, just I was saying any country is perfect, but this thing that every conceivable problem can be attributed to American capitalism is just insane. And no one's going to church anymore. Obviously, I'm exaggerating, but I saw that I think in the U.S. There are many people now identifying as atheists as go to mainline denominations. Tremendous numbers. So if you have a situation where I don't have a sense of country, I don't have a sense of family, and I don't have a faith, where does that meaning come from? I think some people now are suggesting, and I am getting to agree with this, that it's coming through a certain political movements. So if I can go and have this identity politics, and either feel that I'm a victim of principalities and powers, to use a biblical phrase, or if I was to use a postmodern philosophical phrase, it would be power structures. That's what they use in postmodern philosophy. So I'm a victim of power structures, or I'm a oppressor in the power structure, and I can be a social justice warrior to rectify this. That's where I get my meaning from. Actually, I was talking to a guy literally this morning, and he was saying how we all need in our lives to have meaning to pursue the good, capital G good. And if for you good is trying to resolve this injustice in society, how am I going to, what evidence would I have to convince you? Because if I convince you that what you're doing is a little delusional or harmful, I'm taking away your meaning.
Yeah, and people will defend that with their dying breath. Like when you're talking about meaning versus truth, that sounds like emotions versus logic, and we all know which one wins out in a stressful situation. We know which one people are going to literally die for, especially when you put out those three legs of the stool: family, community, or country, and faith. Absolutely, their history is full of stories, well documented and poorly documented, of death following conflicts in all three of those.
Yeah, I mean, Nathan, think about this. So think about, some of the people that some of the people that we know, very firm believers in what you might call a very conservative Christian orthodoxy. And let's say all you want to do is convince them that there's really only one God and the Trinity doesn't exist. You can almost believe in anything else, but just there's no argument you will ever make, because that is so much a person, what gives them meaning. To convince them otherwise, you're taking meaning away from them. Now, we do know that people change their mind on things like this. But, your question is, what argument do you give a social justice warrior, atheist, whatever, that what this person is doing is incorrect? It's not a logical discussion. Say if there's a logical discussion, that's easy actually. That's you can show that the idea of liberalism, and by liberalism I don't mean Canadian Liberal Party, I mean liberal in the European sense of the importance of the individual, that holding that as a guiding principle has resulted in continuing flourishing for humans. That's an easy win on the debate. And this idea that once we chop ourselves up into groups, that tends to go to really bad places. Yeah, that's an easy debate. But just because you win the debate won't mean you will convince a person when it has something to do with their meaning.
Yeah, because
Does that
whenever
make
you're
sense?
talking about debating about like beliefs, you can never convince someone out of a belief. They have to relinquish that belief. Like they'll die holding on to that belief. So it's really, as far as I can tell, in my minutes I've spent thinking about this or whatever it is, the closest that you can do to convincing someone out of their belief is show them repeated evidence over a wide range of topics that they care about, where their belief in a cause and an action, or a cause and an effect, don't line up with what their belief says it should do. So like if you believe that, like let's take the example of surface level karma. So people in North America don't have a grasp of what karma can actually do in terms of damage like people in Asia do, where it has a much more intrinsic, interwoven reality in life. But if you take the idea that if I do good, good will happen to me, and then someone challenges that and says, okay, well, you've been pretty good, but look at all these awful things happening to you over and over and over. Maybe maybe that doesn't happen. Maybe it does. I don't know. But if in that hypothetical situation, you could show someone that their belief is not standing up to what they say it will over a period of time. And aside from something like that, I don't know of a way to convince someone out of a belief. Otherwise, it just doesn't really work.
Yeah, I mean, you are right, because there's a book that's interesting. It's called, I forget the name of the book. It's a philosopher out of Portland, but he's talking about like basically street Socrates. And so Socrates would always go and like ask questions. He wouldn't give answers. He would just ask questions. And so the idea that, it's like, well, you believe this. So why you believe this? And then, well, why do you do that? And if you kind of, drill down to all these questions, maybe get the point where a person says, well, maybe you're right. I don't know what I'm talking about. But you have to, the person still has to be willing to entertain the questions, right? So, they have to have a belief that they hold somewhat likely to even be open to talk about it. And so, see, this where it gets difficult too, because it used to be within sort of the liberal tradition that I have a belief about something, and I think it's true, but I could be wrong. And you might have a belief about the same thing that's different than mine. And so if we talk about it rationally based on logic and evidence, that maybe one of us could be convinced, or maybe both of us would change, and we both have a better idea of what truth is on this matter. And that used to be a thing. It used to happen. But now language is not seen as a tool for mutual discovery of truth. It's seen as a tool of violence. So now if you say something that is not consistent with my belief, I cancel you, cancel culture, shut you down, you're done. This type of discussion that you're talking about, it's under threat too.
How powerful do you think it could possibly be to open up some kind of a debate, discussion, public discourse of some kind, using that same framing of, we are using this conversation not to destroy each other. This is purely for mutual discovery of truth, and set that as the parameters of this is what this is about. And as soon as you're unable to contain yourself within that framework, the natural consequences are we boot you out or cancel you. I don't know how all that would work, but
so once again, it depends on your worldview. So in my worldview, you can do that, and that is being done. But there's another worldview that says, well, truth doesn't exist. All there is power. So if all there is power, then why would we ever attain that? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, it was interesting. There was something I read. It was a scholar, I think I do like transgender studies or something. And she was invited to a conference to speak with some other people. And the idea was kind of like what you suggested, is that, different views on a matter to discuss it. Once she found out that there was going to be people with different views, she refused to show up.
She just
That's
only
not,
wanted to be in an echo chamber, would never
yeah,
venture out.
yeah. But that's not uncommon right now,
Well, it's
right? I mean,
frightening. It's frightening because
it's
when you know how damaging someone else can be with their words, as we were saying, using words as weapons or for violence, you could have a kind of like fear of being damaged, and professionally or emotionally or however.
yeah, yeah. So some of the stuff, sometimes I wonder um, if I'm in my own echo chamber and studying this stuff, and like I'm somewhat exaggerating the import of this, but then I will say that, and then I will hear a professor in a personal conversation from a major university in Canada say that he refuses to talk about anything related to race with a person of color at the university, because the smallest faux pas could have serious consequences for him. I don't think
So
that's good.
no, I agree. I don't think that's a good thing either. And like to deny having a conversation about this kind of stuff, yeah, that doesn't help anything. Like
No.
I've heard it said. Sorry, my camera's being weird again. I've heard it said that there's really no fix for hate speech aside from better speech. Like you don't fix hate speech by shutting it off. You fix it by replace or talking about it, unpacking it, understanding it. And once you understand something, then you can decide to ignore it. But if it's having a negative effect and you don't understand it, then you can't really do much about it aside from trying to stop it. But that doesn't fix the problem in this case.
Yeah. So the hate speech thing. So here's the issue with hate speech. So if you really don't like me, but we create laws that stop you from saying that you don't like me under threat of punishment. The fact that we stop you from saying that you don't like me doesn't make you like me. All it does is means that you don't like me and I don't know about it. I would think that it would be helpful if I knew that you didn't like me, because maybe we could talk it out and you'd find that you do like me. Or maybe I could avoid you. But nowhere do I see some great benefit in me not knowing that you don't like me because we just canceled your speech.
Right, it's about as helpful as just painting over like a mold spot in the wall. It doesn't fix it. It just means you don't see it anymore, and it probably just gets worse.
Yeah. I mean, it's not ethical. It's not logical. The other thing is, it used to be that you had such things that were like truly verbal aggressions, and they were bad. But then you had, uh, and verbal aggressions, one of the characteristics, other than being verbal aggressions, they were usually had intent. So I said something with the intent to hurt you with my language. That's pretty significant stuff. And usually when you talk about verbal aggression, there'd be something where, we could ask the question, well, I understand that you felt harmed, but we say, well, morally, should you feel? Because just because you feel harmed doesn't mean you should. So we could ask that question. In this situation, yeah, I mean, intent, verbal aggression, yeah, someone's to blame. But then you get to see what we call microaggressions, where, okay, should you feel harmed? And sometimes, see, microaggressions used to be called what was known as a faux pas sometimes. A faux pas would be something that someone said with no intent, that was minor, that was just, perhaps inappropriate. I'm at a dinner party in Houston. Someone makes a joke about Canadians trying to be funny. they don't know I'm from Canada. You know, no intent, no great harm. Probably wouldn't have even said it if they had known it hurt my feelings. That used to be known as a faux pas. But now you see in some realms, there's no such thing as a faux pas. Everything is an aggression. And if there's an aggression, you happen to have a victim and someone who committed the aggression. Once again, it's driving people apart. And now, intent doesn't matter in some realms. You know, if someone says something that harms someone else, they're to blame regardless of the intent of their speech. So, once again, I think from a moral perspective, some of the stuff that you see happening around this, right? Intent doesn't matter. Microaggressions, things like this. It's not positive. It's not positive. What do you think?
It's, you know, I fully agree that that is not positive at all. And the idea of redefining a faux pas as a microaggression, to me, what that screams is the death of nuance, which, if you wanted to be loose in your synonyms, could be also worded as getting dumber as a society, or at the very least not celebrating careful consideration or any kind of meaningful thought. So here's the question then that because I'm going to have to wrap this up pretty soon, unfortunately. I've been really enjoying this.
Yeah, me too.
But my question now is, at some point, this is new. At some point in your life, you've never heard of this and you're exposed to this for the very first time. And I don't know if this is going to be the podcast that is that moment for somebody, but let's pretend that it is. And let's say this, the person who is exposed to this for the first time is not taking offense at maybe having some beliefs that they've held onto for a long time being questioned and dashed to the ground, or called a death of nuance. What are some first steps or places that are like easy to try out in exploring, opening oneself up to nuance or thinking about these things in different ways, and not just like, well, this happened, so we must do that, but instead following those actions further down the line? Where's the place that someone could start?
Well, yeah, you ask great and complicated questions.
You're welcome.
So it's almost like that's a little bit hard because you need to know kind of where the person is at and what their background is. So, but I would say this, that, so since we're talking about philosophy, it really helps if you were sort of educated the right way. And what I mean by the right way could be like your family, you know, what your dad taught you. It could be the school you went to, some teacher, and that taught you how to think correctly. This is not a sense of indoctrination. It's that in the sort of the liberal sense that if you get taught the right way, then when you come across bad ideas, like the lack nuance or things of that nature, it's kind of like a vaccine. You know, you can still maybe get sick, but it helps you differentiate the good ideas from the bad. So if, which is quite possible right now, you know, you've been, you know, you've never developed some of these ways of thinking well, well, you need to do it yourself. So how do you do that yourself? Well, this is where it gets a little bit to kind of like how you find this. So, you know, if the issue you're struggling with is identity politics, then you need to read some good books on what it means to be human, liberalism, the value of the individual distinct from a group. If your issue is in ethics and you're concerned, what does ethics mean? Well, I think you need to go back to Aristotle and the idea of well-being. And what does it mean for a human to have well-being? And see, once you immerse yourself into these great ideas, right? Mortimer Adler had these, like, you know, the great ideas of Western thought. And once you start to immerse yourself the right way, then all of a sudden you said, oh, you start to learn nuance. You know, I know that's not a quick and easy answer, But I think the question you pose is so deep that there is no easy answer to it. I mean, all I can say, if you or any of your associates have an issue, I have lots of resources to suggest on which way we can go in trying to drive some positive changes.
When you say that, yeah, it does make sense. And when you say that it depends on how you're educated, my first thought, and I could be just imbalanced from where I've got my information from, but from what I've heard, especially what's made the news in regards to education shifting, it sounds like education changing up the way that it's opening up ideas or indoctrinating students, like one or the other, kind of feels like it's diluting the vaccine. But on the positive side, there's so much information now available for free that it is entirely up to an individual's self-motivation and their own drive as to whether or not they're actually going to discover those things for themselves. Because despite all the noise, there is still available solutions and ways to learn about something. Or even if it's not going to change your belief, you still could at least understand the opposite side of the fence as to why they are on the opposite side.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you about the education thing. So, it seems like the education system is becoming more a propaganda system for a certain ideology, which is terrible.
Yeah, like that is the method to freedom. Getting information that opens up why you are the way you are and conflicts with your own belief as a way of giving yourself like a mental exercise. To take that away from a generation is horrible.
It is. And here's the other issue that contributes to that. So I've used this example before. It used to be that, let's say you had an issue on identity politics, etc. Maybe you go to a bookstore and you look in the political section and you'd see different titles across the spectrum. Maybe you pick out a couple of different views, and maybe if you've been taught how to think, you can think through them for yourself and end up in a good space. Well, now what happens? Well, you buy one book on Amazon that seems to look good, and then what happens? You get suggested 20 more. We think you'll like this one, not because they challenge your ideas, because they all represent the same ideas. And all of a sudden, you'll get sent about a Facebook group that all shares the same idea. So all of a sudden, you can have a whole bunch of people who say, "Well, hey, COVID? Oh, that's a myth. This is a government conspiracy that's coded, right?" And if you challenge that, it's like, "What do you mean? There's a whole bunch of books out there and all these Facebook groups, and everyone knows it's a myth." So social media is also a significant part of this problem. So you have indoctrination by the school system coupled by a social media echo chamber. And it's kind of like, if we want to get back to what you were talking about, Nathan, in this whole discussion, which I love, back to an honest discussion with different ideas to arrive at truth, we need to come back to a competition of ideas in a civil, liberal sense.
So the key truly is education, and education without suggestion based on previous books or whatever. It's a bad way to put it, but
yeah, agreed. I could go on, man. How much time do we have?
Unfortunately, I actually need to go now. I've got about 3 minutes until I need to head off to a meeting. But I've really enjoyed this. We should definitely do another one of these. If you're down for it.
Oh yeah, definitely. I love these conversations, and like I said, I'm sure things will change by the time we do it again.
Sounds great. Okay, well, hey, thank you so much for this. I'm gonna roll that silly video again, and until next time.
Hey, take care.